Welcome back, class. So for this session, we're going to start back in time. We're going to start looking at the first of the three historical avant-garde movements that are in some ways involved with participatory forms of art. So we're going to start in Italy and with Futurism, which is an important if problematic movement for the history of performance art and for the history of participatory art, and more broadly, socially engaged art. So what I'm going to do for you in this lecture, I'm going to give you a little bit of the background ideas of the movement. If you've never studied Futurism, it'll be key to know what they were all about, and how these ideas in some ways naturally dovetail into these participatory themes that we're studying all semester long. And then after that, I'm going to give you a few examples of their performances, of what they did to engage the public directly in these participatory, or maybe let's say proto-participatory forms of art. And so the natural starting point, I think, for Futurism, as it often is with the Manifesto from 1909, which was written by this guy who's giving you this side eye with his mustache, F.T. Marinetti. And he started writing the Manifesto, I think, about a year before this, in 1908. And he most famously got it published in Le Figaro, which is really unbelievable. This is the equivalent of an art collective or an artist publishing their manifesto in the front page of the Wall Street Journal. It's really an incredible feat for an artist and unthinkable today. But he did publish it in lots of different places, in lots of different countries, in different formats. So he had this ambition of just disseminating these ideas wide and far. And his manifesto, as almost all manifestos do, laid out what his art and his vision for art should be. He was a poet, but he is going to create this coalition between painters and sculptors, and theater and musicians. So the manifesto lays out what he thinks art should be, but most importantly, and this is the key kernel of most manifestos, is he lays out how art is going to change society and politics. So right off the bat, a manifesto is almost inherently socially engaged. It has a conception of changing politics and actually dealing with and affecting reality. And Marinetti and the Futurists are definitely no exception. In some ways, this is one of the founding manifestos of the 20th century. So let's just go through some of the key ideas. So the first thing to realize is that the Futurists wanted to establish a direct connection with mass culture. There's a really telling quote by Marinetti, who again, he starts off as a symbolist poet. And this is just a few years before the Manifesto. And kind of pessimistic and resigned, he says, no one reads poetry. Right? No one reads poetry. And with that sort of resigned, pretty pessimistic statement about poetry, you can already tell it makes sense that he would then want to leave poetry as this hermetic, abstruse, sort of elite form of art towards a direct engagement with the public and with everyday people. But as you're going to see, this direct engagement with everyday people is not so simple. It's also not so innocent. So it's a complicated maneuver here, moving from elite poetry to this more populist form of art making. The other thing that Futurism was all about is fusing art with technology. So they were obsessed with the latest forms of technology, especially really fast cars, speed, trains, velocity. All these things are really wrapped up in the futurist ideology. And it's not only fusing art and technology. It was also the idea of fusing the human body with technology, of almost becoming a cyborg. The legacy of this sci-fi cyborgian figure can be traced back at least to Futurism. And obviously this has been a rich idea for lots of different things in culture. And one of the most famous quotes from the Futurist Manifesto is, "A speeding automobile is more beautiful than the victory of Smoth race." This is the victory of Smoth race, probably the most famous Greek Hellenistic statue that today you can see at the Louvre in Paris. So Marinetti is saying that, this fast car is more beautiful than this old sculpture. So that should already tell you a lot about what the futurists saw and how they understood the merits of the past and of history. The most problematic aspect of futurism was their relationship to the war. And if you read the history of World War I, already by 1912, 1911, even in the first decade of the 20th century, people understood uneasily that something was coming, that there was a war on the way. And if you study the historical avant-gardes, most of them are anti-war. Most of them, like Dada, they're horrified by the war. Futurism is that strange breed of avant-garde art movement that was right-wing when it came to war, and not only war. It embraced war for reasons that I'm going to lay out for you in a moment. Marinetti even enlisted voluntarily to go to war. And so there was something about war, which is naturally wrapped up in technology, war machines, airplanes, bombs, velocity, speed, destruction. All these things are part of the futurist ideology and their cultural program. Their idea for a revolution based in violence. And I think you can see how this will naturally lead them towards fascist politics in Italy. And it's being formed around the same time. And some scholars even argue that Italian fascism was in some ways conditioned by or influenced by these futurists. Right? So we're dealing with dangerous ideas here. And one of those strange avant-garde movements that are actually fascist, that's inherently fascist and in right wing in many ways. So we'll talk more about that towards the end of the lecture. There's a really well-known primal scene of this manifesto that Marinetti talks about. For time, I'm not going to read this passage, but it tells of his car accident that he had. He was trying to avoid a bicyclist, and he ended up capsizing his Fiat in a ditch. And normally you'd think, well, traumatic experience. He didn't have a scratch. He was fine. But it sounds like, car crashes is not the sort of thing you want to get into. It might even be something that's traumatic. It might be something that you'd be fearful of, and you wouldn't think of fondly. Marinetti had the opposite reaction. It was a thrill. It was, he says right here, a red hot iron of joy. He's almost describing himself melding and becoming like his car. He and his car are like becoming one and the same, like a fused entity, like a cyborg, more like a machine punk cyborg, something like that. And for him, this was an adrenaline rush. Like this speed, this violence, and this destruction is something that was energizing for him, right? So right off the bat, you're seeing the futurist ideology not only about speed, about violence, about destruction, but also almost like adrenaline junkie, embracing pain, embracing catastrophe, and really going all the way through. Really committing itself all the way through in its ideas. And we can extrapolate that primal scene towards the relationship with war. If this car crash is this epiphany for Marinetti, then he realizes that this destruction can lead to a joyous new world, a better world. For him, it will be like a more noble world. And to get there, he thinks that war and destruction is what can pave the way. So in very problematic terms, he says, we intend to glorify war, the only hygiene of the world, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of anarchists, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and contempt for women. These lines already contains so much of what fascism is. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end, but sometimes there's some misconceptions about what fascism is, especially in relation to communism or socialism or other really important or influential political ideologies in history. So the first thing to know about fascism is that it's probably the most right-wing ideology that you can get. It privileges militarism and the police, order, and war. It privileges patriotism for the nation. So fascism is highly, highly nationalistic. So in this context, this militaristic ideology is in the service of Italy. Marinetti is very, very much a patriot for Italy, an Italian patriot. There's also this, in fascism, there's also this sort of macho, very alpha male kind of thing. Almost like Fight Club, if you've ever seen that movie from the 90s. This idea that a glorification of violence, a glorification of toughness, a glorification of pain, and a debasing of all the ideas that are opposite of that, or perceived to be the opposite of that. So like socialism, people getting together for a common cause, pacifism, people getting together for ideas that would have to do with peace or justice or equity, or the idea that women are more passive, that they're not as inherently violent or whatever. All these problematic ideas, these are all wrapped up in the futurist ideology and in fascist ideas. So you see where we're headed here with this manifesto. And when he says that war is the only hygiene of the world, he's not speaking figuratively. He's not only saying that those who love war are the militaristic or the patriotic or the macho males in society. He means it literally. He intends to destroy museums. He intends to destroy libraries. He intends to destroy universities. Everything that is musty and old and of the past needs to go for a futurist. And the futurist wants to start with a clean slate, moving forward, right? And this is not only museums, libraries, and universities, but also morality itself, that morality being this old, dusty thing, feminism. There were women futurists, which is interesting, but there are definitely anti-feminist and misogynist ideas in the early futurist manifestos, and any idea that society should in some ways be equal is deemed to be cowardly by the futurists. So the futurists have an understanding of themselves as artist warriors above society. That they are the great ones who can lead towards a more noble, glory-filled future, right? Where everything from the past is going to be destroyed. And then one other thing from the manifesto, which is interesting, which they don't abide by. But he says that the oldest of us is 30. So we have one decade left. So when they reach 40, they should just be thrown out, and a younger generation should take over. So this is seeing their ideas all the way through. The idea that youthfulness, vigor, violence, and the future built on these ideas. That in the future you'll have to keep with those ideas, right? So they themselves will become dinosaurs, and they themselves will need to be destroyed to make way for the future. So that gives you a pretty good encapsulation or overview of the manifesto and what the futurists were all about. And if you're interested in the history of these ideas, I highly recommend this book by Benjamin Noyes. It's called Malign Velocities. He talks about this. He begins with Futurism, actually, and he goes all the way up to the present. And he describes this form of thinking as accelerationism. the futurists, rather than trying to work with society, work with the present conditions, which are already, of course, obviously in the early 20th century capitalist, try to show people, educate people about its contradictions, try to come up with ways where we can have a more equitable, just society, one that would be more fair, less exploitive, so on and so forth. The futurists, instead, they had no faith in people. They had no faith in socialism, which inherently does have faith in educating people, in getting people to care about other people and care about equity and social justice. They had no faith in that. So what they thought instead, they thought they could use the present conditions and exacerbate them, accelerate them, make them worse, so that they would kind of destroy themselves, and then they could go on to the future, right? So this idea of considering the present moment to not be bad enough yet, that you need to go even further in order to get to something better. There are seeds of that in Marx. There are seeds in that in the history of leftist politics. And more recently, philosophers beginning in the 90s who were associated with accelerationism, these are somewhat, well, no, not somewhat, they're very pessimistic thinkers, that they think that capitalism, especially late global capitalism, it's terrible, but there's no going back, and there's no use fighting it, because capitalism will co-opt everything. And so the only way out is to go forward, and the only way out is to make capitalism even worse, and to exacerbate, to go further in its contradictions, in its exploitation, in its violence, and only then can you get through to the other side. So I have a lot of problems with this line of thinking. Be interested to hear what you think about it. The most obvious or the most critical flaw in accelerationist politics is that the one thing we can't do when it comes to the climate, when it comes to global warming, when it comes to the Anthropocene, is that we can't keep going. We can't accelerate that, because that will be it won't be selective destruction. It will be global destruction. There won't be a future to fight for. So accelerationism doesn't work so well within times of ecological crisis. But for sure, the futurists are in line with this form of thinking of accelerationism. To take the present conditions, don't try to make them better, but like almost pour salt into the wound to lead towards a future. So it inherently entails, it's a pessimistic politics that thinks that we have to have a certain amount of destruction before we can get to a better place. So if you're interested in this history, this is a very good book, and quite readable. Okay, so the other really key aspect of futurism. So we've talked about futurism as a fascist ideology, as wrapped up with war, as wrapped up with technology. The other thing they're very committed to is the crowd, la folla in Italian. And this is where we get to the most pertinent aspect of futurism for our class. And Christine Poggi has written a whole book on futurism. It's a very good book. And she quotes the futurist ideology of crowds. And she says that the future is desired to integrate with the masses in order to experience the exhilarating tumult at its explosive center. So what she's saying here is that the futurist almost wanted to use the energy of crowds, of large groups of people, in order to harness that energy and to feeling that energy, which I don't know, in a time of COVID-19, crowds and being around people has a different resonance. But before this, if you've ever been in a large crowd, either for a concert or for a sporting event or for a rally or a protest, whatever it might be, I've certainly been probably in all of those, there is this sort of psychic thing that happens to you in a crowd, a type of euphoria, a type of groupthink, it elicits a certain response that can be quite powerful, very, very powerful. And that power can lead towards good things, and that power can lead to destructive things, right? There are really beautiful crowds that maybe you've been a part of where you feel like, wow, we're in solidarity with a noble idea. Or there can be crowds that can be very destructive. Crowds that become violent and sort of self-defeating or self-destructive. This is the crowd that the futurists were trying to harness. But the second part of this quote is also really important, because Poggi says they desired to stand above or beyond it in order to make the crowd an instrument of their will. So Marinetti was actually fascinated but also fearful of the crowd. Like he worried about losing his individuality in the crowd. So the futurists had this very elitist artist warrior conception of themselves vis-a-vis the crowd, where the crowd almost becomes their medium, right? This is very clear how this is syncing up with our theme of participatory art in this class. And it's really interesting because right in the latter part of the 19th century, earlier 20th century, you had some of the first psychologists and thinkers dealing with crowd psychology, dealing with what does it mean for a human being to be in a crowd, and what does that do to the human subject, to the human individual. What is a crowd, right? And the futurists were reading all about this, and it was very interesting to them because they understood that crowds could be very powerful entities, very powerful forces that could be harnessed. And so that's a really good entry point into the activities of the futurists. So one of the most famous things that they did, of course, they made paintings and sculptures and so on and so forth in their futurist film. But probably their most cutting edge and important contributions to avant-garde art are their socially engaged participatory forms of work where they used and they worked with the audience. The most famous would be these seratas, these soirees. And I'm not going to talk too much about them because they're going to be presented on. But I think you can see how these seratas that involve the public directly, how this would be a natural development in futurist aesthetics with what they were with their ambitions of crowds and even violence and so on and so forth. So we'll talk about that more when we get to our presentation. But I did want to give you some other examples that are not seratas and that Bishop doesn't mention so much in her text. So someone like Alberto Boccioni, who's really well known, he's a really wonderful painter. He's a futurist painter. He becomes involved with Marinetti. He's part of the third serata, the first one that involved painters. And in his works, you'll see a lot of these themes that we've been establishing today. So violence, crowds, electricity, technology, and social disunion. So this is a really well-known painting of his called Rizza in the Gallery, a brawl in the Galleria. It's a scene of very well-to-do people. This is the bourgeoisie, and it's at night. So this will be a very chic, well-known area of Rome. No, I'm sorry, this was Milan. This Galleria, this arcade of shops, and what he's painted is it's maybe hard to see, but you have two women here who are actually prostitutes, so that already is incendiary, especially for the bourgeoisie. They're actually having a fight. They're fighting each other. They're tussling. They're locked arm in arms. And this is creating like a ripple effect of people who are passing by, who themselves then get involved in this brawl. And there's this one guy in a tuxedo or a suit and a top hat. He's sort of running out at you in his view at the viewer. He's running out at you. His mouth is open. It looks like he's screaming. His arms are up in the air. He seems to be running away from the brawl. You as a viewer, however, are kind of being sucked into it because the energy of everyone else is going towards the lights and towards these two women that are fighting. And so this is a painting that's that's lionizing and thematizing and indulging in the idea of this group of people, of this crowd, and the violent energy of this fight, of this brawl. And it's really breaking down the decorum of bourgeois society, which normally would be all about pretenses, remaining civil. The last thing they would ever do is start having a brawl in front of this shop. And even worse for them, like a brawl that involves two prostitutes, which are deemed to be, for them would be the lower depths of society. So this is a painting that's already thematizing this interest in violence and the crowd, and harnessing the energy of the crowd in the painting. But keep in mind that they didn't just paint this stuff. When you read about the seratas, when you read about the activities that they would do, the futurists really did get into brawls. Like, they did everything they could to instigate the public, and to actually get into fights. And they did get into fights quite often, especially after their performances, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And here's another work by Boccioni, a really famous painting, and it's a wonderful painting, The City Rises. The themes in this painting are interesting, but for me, I don't know about you, like, it's not that compelling of a painting. It's a bit of a mess in some ways. But when you move to The City Rises, this is a really, really compelling, amazing painting. And you get a similar sense of this city as something that can be, as this energy that can be harnessed, this crowd of people that their energy can be harnessed towards whatever end. Again, for the futurists, this would be a destructive energy leading to a clean slate for a patriotic, noble Italian future, right? And one of the things I love about this painting is that the way in which the energy is evoked is through the figure of this horse in the center that seems to be like the men in the picture. They're having a hard time restraining this horsepower in the center of the picture plane. And if you go back and read the manifestos, it's pretty wild. The futurists are all about technology. They're all about, like, the cutting edge, all these newer things. But almost at every turn, they take recourse to metaphors and to figurations of animality, of animals, which is really interesting, because there's not. I mean, these tropes about animals and about horses and horsepower and this kind of thing is actually kind of old, right? It's actually not cutting edge at all. So it's a really fascinating thing. Their idea of this energy they could harness was somehow tied up with a kind of an old conception of animality and of animals. But again, this shows you the futurist ambition to harness the energy of the city, harness the energy of the crowd, and in this case, it's ciphered through the figure of the animal. And what I find fascinating, because this is the topic I work on animals in art, 20th century and contemporary art, is that all these guys that were writing about crowd theory, which we talked about before, that very much influenced the futurists. These writers were influenced by animal psychology. They were influenced by the very beginnings of the studies of animals, and so they made analogies between crowds and, like, beehives, for example. So the idea that the way a beehive functions, how one bee is integrated within this whole mass of bees. These crowd theorists argued that was how human societies and human crowds also worked. There was a way in which when humans get into a crowd, it's almost like they become more animal. They lose their individuality, and they start to have more of a hive mentality, right? All these ideas are actually problematic and old. They're old conceptions of animals, but it's still a really fascinating connection between animals, crowd psychology, and this painting, and the writings in the futurist writings, that almost at every turn they take recourse They talk about animals and horsepower and wolves and whatever else. There's so many of them. So the futurists also worked with collage. They're influenced by Cubism and Picasso and Braque. And probably the most well-known is Carlo Cara, who was also a painter, an artist associated with Marinetti and the very first Serrata and the very first Manifestos. And this is called Interventionist Demonstration. It's a collage of text and newspapers. And a lot of people point out how this looks like this encapsulates futurist ideology in so many ways. One, it's almost a representation of the crowd through newspaper clippings. So imagine walking through a crowd and you hear everybody talking. One guy's talking about like sports. Somebody else is talking about what they saw on television. Somebody else is talking about the dinner they just had. Everybody's talking about their own thing. So it's this cacophony of voices. And you're almost getting that in this vortex of words. It's almost like Cara is trying to represent the sounds of the crowd and the movement and velocity and energy of the crowd through this collage. The other thing it doubles for is a propeller and maybe like the very front of a military plane, which would further align itself with futurist ideology of war and technology and destruction. So the idea is that this is the front of the plane. Think of those, like, I don't know, Spitfires or whatever those old planes, World War I planes were like. The front there would be the nozzle, and then all this is the propeller rotating around. So it seems to be a representation of the crowd. It seems to be this propeller. And it also has many references to, many references to Italy. So there's also this sort of patriotic aspect to this that's very much part of this like Italian fascist sort of ideology. Cara was likely influenced by Marinetti's poetry, which also tried to use words, and in many cases onomatopoeias. Onomatopoeia is, it doesn't mean something, it sounds like something. So Zang Tum Tum was Marinetti's very famous book, and an instance of onomatopoeia. Zang Tum Tum was an onomatopoeia for like cannon fire or artillery, right? And you can actually see it right here, Zang Tum Tum. Cara's referenced it in his collage. So Marinetti's poetry, which is using sounds from technology, sounds from war, sounds from everyday life, he's using in his poetry. It's showing up in Cara's work. And if we're talking about sounds, we have to then talk about Luigi Rusolo. And I can't recommend enough the extra essay I gave you for this week if you ever have time, and especially if you're interested in the history of music and the history of avant-garde music and noise and ambient electronic music and so on and so forth. Rusolo is really important for this. So Rusolo, like Boccioni's, like Cara's painting, and like Marinetti's poetry, his conception of music, of futurist composition, of futurist music, would be one that incorporates technology, the crowd, the streets, the city, all this energy that we've been dealing with today, that the futurists are trying to harness in their work. And so he tries to replicate this in his compositions, and he even built his own instruments, these noise instruments. And this is an actual photograph. This is him, and these are his noise instruments that he built himself, that would replicate various noises, industrial noises, noises from locomotives, noises from everyday city life. Right. So he wrote a manifesto called The Art of Noises, and he says at some point in this manifesto, let's cross a great modern capital city, a great modern capital, with ears more attentive than eyes, and we'll enjoy picking out the eddying of water, air, and gas in metallic pipes, the rumble of motors that breathe and pulse with an indisputable animality. See, this figure of animals coming back so often with the Futurists. The throbbing of valves, back and forth of pistons, the screeching of mechanical saws, the bouncing of trams on rails, cracking of whips, so on and so forth, right? And then, of course, at the end, flags, nationalism, patriotism, so on and so forth. So his idea of music, which is so influential because in 1913, as you'll see in a moment, this was like laughable. No one understood what he was doing. But odds are, is you listen to music that has sampled all sorts of different sounds. And if you know a little bit about the history of electronic music, the history of noise music, or sound art, beginning in the 60s and forward, someone like John Cage, who said he was influenced by Rusolo, you will find a conception of music where any noise is a possibility, a compositional possibility, right? So Rusolo is so ahead of his time here. It's quite wonderful. But let's not lose sight of the fact of two things. One, this is again a fusion of art and technology, a fusion of these modern technological processes in the city, and it's also one that seems to be trying to tap into a certain power of the city and of the crowds, and of nationalistic patriotism. And so this is in 1913. And in 1914, he has this really well-known public event. So this is like a serata, but it was more of a billed to be like a concert, a music concert. And it was called the Gran Concerto Futurista. It happened on April 21st, 1914. And it was the unveiling of these noise instruments that he had made. And this is I think it's the only photograph of this event. So you have the different futurists up on stage. They're behind the noise instruments, and they're working with the noise instruments. And what's amazing about this performance is that the crowd was there, and there were a lot of people there. These futurist seratas, these futurist concerts and public performances were really, really popular. There was definitely a demand for them. And so the concert starts after Marinetti introduces the proceedings. The concert starts, and at first people are kind of quiet, and the noise instruments are going. And then after a while, once they realize that these noise instruments, and I'm going to play you one in a moment, they're really like this monotonous, grating, industrial sound, right? Once they start realizing that this is the music, well, they start laughing first. They start sort of howling and whistling. And by all accounts, once this starts, you can't hear the music anymore. Like, you can't hear the sound anymore. The crowd has integrated itself with the noisemakers. So, like, it was hard to tell what the music was. Then laughter and ridicule and whistling, and also the throwing of vegetables and stuff at the musicians themselves. There was always this physical confrontation between the crowd and the futurists, and the futurists welcomed this because, again, they welcomed violence, they welcomed destruction. After that, a brawl started to break out. Like, people actually started fighting. Marinetti at some point jumps out into the crowd, starts fighting with someone. So it becomes this, the concert has to end because it just becomes this big fight. And the fight continues afterwards. Like, they have to leave. They have to leave the theater because they're really outnumbered. They end up at this restaurant nearby, and then the crowd starts to build up at the restaurant, and then there are fights outside. It's really very futurist. This idea that this concert would elicit public aggression, would elicit this violence, which is exactly what the futurists were after. And so this gets to one idea in the Bishop text that should be the most troubling for us. And that's the idea, she says at one point, that destructive modes of participation might be more inclusive. And that should be really troubling. So here we have artists that are sort of working with the less noble instincts of the public, which would be the instinct for ridicule, for throwing things, and for violence, and for fusion in this crowd in this sort of aggressive atmosphere. And I'm not sure if she's right, but if she is, it's depressing. Where she says that destructive modes of participation might be more inclusive, and what she's saying there, it's as if she's saying it's easier for people to participate in something if it's destructive, if it's violent, if it taps into like baser energies of humanity, whereas more noble, more utopian, more high level, or what would be the word? Forms of participation that would be that would have to do more with kindness, that would have to do more with equity, that would have to do more with solidarity, with getting along. That somehow that is more difficult for people to participate in. And here I think you can see we're panning out to the bigger picture. And the more troubling picture, where maybe it's true that in politics, the social body, the people, the public, it has an easier time participating in politics that are in some ways nasty or destructive or hateful or aggressive than their opposites, right? And maybe, I think you can already tell when we're talking about fascism and futurism that some of this uncomfortably is matching and graphing up and syncing up with our contemporary politics of 2020 in the United States, where it does feel like there are some sectors of the public where it seems like they've become politically engaged not because of some noble idea, but because of baser, maybe more aggressive or hateful ideas, or bigoted ideas. So these are troubling. This is a troubling thought, and if it's true in art, then it's really a troubling thing. So I think you see why futurism is such an important precursor for participatory art, and the kind of participatory art that can lead to a dangerous and not necessarily progressive situation. Right? Let me play you very quickly. These were displayed in a museum in 2012. I love this clip because it can't be what the concerts were like, but this is the museum person. She turns them on one by one, and this family is really cool. So each noise instrument has a different sound. Okay, I won't go through all of them just for time. And then we'll just end here because we talked about this at the beginning, but by the time you get to 1919, World War I is over, and there's a consolidation of Italy of the fascist party headed by Mussolini. And Marinetti is actually friends with Mussolini. He eventually becomes Mussolini's cultural advisor. Marinetti even runs for office. This is an artist, a poet who had ambitions of actually being in government. And so this gets to the core question that we're dealing with today. This is in art since 1900. It's a nice way of putting it. This is the question of whether avant-garde practices are still to be situated within the bourgeois public sphere, so like art galleries, museums, so on and so forth, or should they be populist, or should they try to contribute to the formation of a different mass cultural public sphere? Should they actually get directly involved with politics, as the futurists clearly are? This is a huge question for our class. This is a huge question for socially engaged and participatory forms of art. And Bishop makes this point. in her book, she says there's no way of knowing whether a participatory form of work is going to lead to something that's progressive and on the left, or whether it's going to lead to something that's more dominating, fascist, or something that would align itself more with right-wing politics. So there's this malleable aspect to using and working with people, with crowds, and with the public that's inherently unstable, that's inherently charged, and maybe difficult to negotiate with, even if the artist has a certain intention. So very clear how the Futurists really add to this history of participatory art. Okay, I think that's enough for today. Hope you enjoyed it. And then the next session will be about, we'll go to the very opposite of the political spectrum. We'll go to the Bolsheviks in Russia, the Russian Revolution, and the Communist Revolution there in 1917. Take care, everybody.